The autumn wind howled through the cracked boards of Katherine Vance's farmhouse, a bitter reminder that winter would soon grip the Colorado territory with its merciless hand. She stood at the window, calloused fingers pressing against the glass as she surveyed her land, 15 acres of stubborn earth that had taken everything from her, including her husband James, buried beneath the old oak tree for nearly a year now. It was 1873, and Catherine's situation grew more desperate by the day. The last harvest had been meager, barely enough to keep her fed through summer, let alone the harsh winter months ahead. Her cows needed tending, the barn roof had sprung a leak, and the north field remained unplowed. Work that once was shared between two now fell solely on her shoulders, and those shoulders were weary beyond their 30 years. Just a bit longer, she whispered to herself, watching as the first golden leaves spiraled down from the cottonwood trees lining her property. Something will turn up. Katherine had placed notices in Denver City and at the general store in the nearest town, seeking a farmhand. She couldn't afford much room and board, 3 meals daily, and what little money she could spare at month's end. Most men wanted guaranteed wages, not promises. Some had come to look at the place, only to turn around when they saw a woman running the operation alone. The sound of hoofbeats pulled her from her thoughts. Katherine squinted against the setting sun, making out the silhouette of a rider approaching her property. She reached for the shotgun leaning against the wall, a precaution she'd learned was necessary for a woman living alone. The stranger dismounted with a slight stumble, steadying himself against his horse. Even from a distance, Katherine could see the gauntness in his face, the way his clothes hung loosely on his frame. He removed his hat, revealing dark hair streaked with dust from the trail, and approached her porch with measured steps. "Madam," he called out, keeping a respectful distance. "Name's Preston Norwood. I heard in town you might be looking for help before winter sets in." Katherine kept the shotgun visible but lowered. "You heard right, Mr. Norwood, but I'll be straight with you, I can't offer much pay, just meals, shelter, and whatever I can manage when the season turns." The man's eyes, a startling blue against his sun-weathered skin, traveled over the farm, taking in the dilapidated barn, the untended fields, and the splitting fence posts. Rather than discouragement, Katherine saw something like understanding cross his features. "Been riding 3 days," he said, his voice rough from thirst. "Haven't eaten since yesterday morning. I'd work for bread alone right now, madam." Something in his directness, or perhaps the quiet dignity with which he admitted his hunger, made Katherine lower the shotgun completely. "Come in then, Mr. Norwood. Let's talk over supper." She fed him a simple meal of bean stew and cornbread, watching as he struggled not to devour it too quickly. His manners were good despite his obvious hunger, and he thanked her genuinely for the food. In the lamplight, Katherine could better assess her visitor. He was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 28 or 30, with a face that might have been handsome before hardship had carved lines around his eyes and mouth. "Where are you coming from?" Katherine asked, pouring him a second cup of coffee. "All over," Preston replied. "Worked cattle drives in Texas, did some mining in Nevada. Last job was with a rancher up north, but his operation went under after the cattle disease spread through his herd." "And your family?" "Don't have any, madam. Lost my parents when I was young. Been making my own way since I was 16. Katherine nodded, understanding all too well the solitude of having no one to call your own. "My husband died last autumn, pneumonia. It was quick, at least." Preston's eyes met hers. "I'm sorry for your loss." She appreciated that he didn't offer empty platitudes or uncomfortable questions. "Winter's coming fast," she said, changing the subject. "I need to get the north field plowed, repair the barn roof, and bring in firewood. The cows need milking daily, and there are 100 other tasks that need doing if this place is going to survive another year." "I can do all that," Preston said confidently. "I've worked every kind of farm job there is. It'll be long hours and hard work, Mr. Norwood. I'm used to both, Mrs. Vance." Katherine studied him for a moment longer. She had little choice. Winter wouldn't wait for a better option to come along. "There's a small room off the barn. It's nothing fancy, but it's dry and has a bed. You can start tomorrow." Preston nodded, relief visible in the slight relaxation of his shoulders. I'm grateful for the chance, madam. I won't let you down. Catherine couldn't know if that was true, but as she showed him to the small bunk room after supper, she found herself hoping it would be. Hope was a luxury she hadn't allowed herself much of lately. The next morning, Catherine woke before dawn as usual, only to find Preston already in the barn, having milked 2 of the 5 cows. He'd located the leaky spots in the roof by the light of a lantern and was making a list of materials needed for repairs. "You're up early," she commented, carrying a basket with bread, cheese, and apples for his breakfast. "Sun's wasting, Mrs. Vance," he replied, wiping his hands on a rag. "Thought I'd get a head start." Over the next few days, Preston proved himself invaluable. He worked from dawn until dusk, repairing fences, patching the barn roof, and plowing the north field with a determination that impressed Catherine. She found herself watching him from the kitchen window as she prepared meals, noting the strength in his arms as he chopped wood or the careful way he handled the livestock. They fell into an easy routine. Breakfast at sunrise, a midday meal Catherine would bring to whichever part of the farm Preston was working on, and supper in the evening, where they would discuss the day's progress and plans for tomorrow. Their conversations were practical at first, focused entirely on the farm, but gradually began to include snippets of their lives. Catherine learned that Preston had been a soldier during the war, fighting for the Union. He'd worked as a ranch hand, a miner, and briefly as a deputy in a small Texas town. She told him about growing up in Pennsylvania, coming west with James after they married, and the dreams they'd had for their farm before illness had claimed him. 2 weeks into Preston's employment, a fierce storm blew in from the mountains. Rain pounded the farmhouse, and lightning cracked across the sky. Catherine was startled awake by a tremendous crash, followed by Preston's voice calling from outside. Throwing a shawl over her nightdress, she opened the door to find him drenched, his hair plastered to his forehead. "Lightning hit the big oak near the barn," he shouted over the wind. "Part of it fell onto the roof. The cows are spooked." Without hesitation, Catherine grabbed her boots and followed him into the storm. Together they worked to calm the frightened animals, moving them to the secure section of the barn while rain poured through the new hole in the roof. Preston hoisted himself up into the rafters, using his body to shield Catherine as debris fell around them. By the time they'd secured the animals and covered the hole with a tarp, they were both soaked to the bone and shivering. Catherine led Preston back to the farmhouse, insisting he come inside rather than return to his cold, damp room. "You'll catch your death," she said, stoking the fire in the hearth. "Get those wet clothes off. I'll find something of James for you to wear." She returned with a flannel shirt and trousers to find Preston standing awkwardly by the fire, having removed only his jacket and boots. His white shirt clung to his torso, revealing a lean but muscular frame. "I don't want to impose, Mrs. Vance," he said, accepting the dry clothes with evident discomfort. "Catherine," she corrected him, suddenly aware of how formal they'd remained despite working side by side for weeks. "And it's not an imposition. You just saved my livestock and half my barn." He nodded, a small smile touching his lips. "Catherine, then, and I'm Preston, not Mr. Norwood." Their eyes held for a moment longer than necessary before Catherine turned away. "Change by the fire. I'll make us some hot coffee." As the storm raged outside, they sat at Catherine's kitchen table, warming their hands on coffee mugs and planning repairs for the barn. There was a new ease between them, the shared emergency having broken down some invisible barrier. When Preston finally returned to his room in the early hours of the morning, Catherine found herself standing at the window long after his lantern light had disappeared, wondering at the strange flutter in her chest. October brought crisp mornings and brilliant foliage. The farm was transforming under Preston's care, with repaired fences, a solid barn roof, and fields ready for the next planting season. Catherine noticed he'd begun to fill out his clothes better, the regular meals putting meat back on his frame and healthy color in his cheeks. One morning, Catherine was gathering eggs when she heard the sound of Preston's axe splitting wood. She watched as he worked, his rhythmic movements strong and sure. When he paused to wipe his brow, he caught her looking. Instead of turning away embarrassed, Katherine found herself smiling at him. "We'll have enough firewood to last 2 winters at this rate," she called. Preston leaned on his axe, returning her smile. "Better too much than too little when the snow comes." "I'm heading into town for supplies today," Katherine said, approaching him. "Is there anything you need?" He seemed about to decline, then reconsidered. "Maybe some tobacco, if you don't mind, and—" He hesitated, looking almost boyishly uncertain. "Perhaps some peppermint sticks. I haven't had one since I was a kid." The simple request touched Katherine unexpectedly. She imagined a younger Preston, perhaps tasting peppermint candy at a county fair in days before war and wandering had hardened him. "Of course," she agreed. In town, Katherine found herself selecting items with more care than usual. She chose a pouch of good tobacco, a handful of peppermint sticks, and after some deliberation, a new shirt she thought would suit Preston's coloring. It had been a long time since she'd thought about pleasing someone else. "At the general store, Mrs. Simmons, the proprietor's wife, commented on Katherine's improved appearance. "You're looking well, Mrs. Vance. I heard you found help for the winter." "Yes, a good farmhand," Katherine replied, suddenly self-conscious about the extra items in her basket. Mrs. Simmons smiled knowingly. "Mr. Caldwell from the feed store mentioned he was a handsome fellow, young too." Katherine felt a blush rising to her cheeks. "He's capable and hardworking, that's what matters." "Of course, dear," Mrs. Simmons agreed, though her expression remained knowing. "Though there's nothing wrong with finding comfort after losing James. It's been nearly a year now." The thought followed Katherine all the way home. Had she been considering Preston in that light? She had noticed his handsome features, certainly, and the way his presence filled a room with a quiet strength she'd come to rely on. But the idea of anything beyond their working relationship seemed impossible, improper, even. Yet when she returned to find Preston had not only completed his regular chores, but had also fixed the loose step on her porch and planted flower bulbs along the walkway for spring color, she felt that flutter again. When she presented him with the tobacco, candy, and new shirt, his genuine pleasure at the simple gifts made her heart skip. "You didn't have to do this," he said, holding the shirt against his chest. "You've done so much for the farm," Katherine replied. It seemed right to give something back. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple, Preston spoke of his plans. "I've been saving to buy a small spread of my own someday. Nothing fancy, just enough land to raise some cattle, maybe grow some crops." "A good dream," Katherine said. "Where would you settle?" Preston looked thoughtful. "Hadn't decided. Somewhere like this, maybe, Colorado's beautiful country." The unspoken question hung in the air between them. How long would he stay? Katherine had hired him to help prepare for winter, but they'd never discussed what would happen after. The thought of him leaving once the worst of winter passed made her chest tighten uncomfortably. As if reading her thoughts, Preston added, "No rush, though. I like it here." Their eyes met in the fading light, and Katherine saw something in his gaze that made her breath catch a warmth that went beyond appreciation for employment and shelter. The first snow came in early November, dusting the farm in white overnight. Katherine woke to find Preston already clearing a path to the barn, his breath visible in the cold air. She called him in for a hearty breakfast of pancakes, bacon, and coffee, watching with satisfaction as he ate with enthusiasm. "I was thinking," she said casually, pouring more coffee, "the farm is too much for one person, even in good weather." Preston looked up, a question in his eyes. "If you wanted to stay on beyond winter," Katherine continued, focusing intently on stirring her coffee, "we could discuss a more permanent arrangement. Perhaps a share of the profits come harvest, in addition to room and board." She risked meeting his gaze and found him studying her with an intensity that made her nervousness evaporate, replaced by something warmer. "I'd like that," he said simply. The following weeks brought them closer, as winter's confinement meant more time spent in each other's company. They played checkers in the evenings, Preston teaching Katherine card games he'd learned on cattle drives, while she read aloud from the few books she owned. Sometimes they simply talked, sharing pieces of their pasts that had previously been too painful to voice. Preston told her about losing his entire family to typhoid when he was 15, about the horrors he'd witnessed during the war, and his years of drifting afterward, never finding a place that felt like home. Katherine spoke of her parents' disapproval of James, of the difficult journey west, and of watching her husband slip away despite her desperate care. "I used to wonder if I'd made a mistake coming out here," Katherine admitted one snowy evening as they sat before the fire. "If we'd stayed back east, perhaps James would have had better medical care, might have survived." Preston shook his head. "You can't know that, and from what you've told me of him, James loved this land. He wouldn't have wanted to die anywhere else." His understanding, free from judgment, loosened something that had been tightly wound inside Katherine for a year. Tears came unbidden, and Preston hesitated only a moment before moving to sit beside her on the sofa, offering a handkerchief and the comfort of his presence. "Thank you," she whispered, aware of his warmth beside her, of how natural it felt to have him there. December brought a blizzard that kept them housebound for 3 days. They took turns braving the weather to tend the animals, always returning with reddened cheeks and frost-tipped eyelashes. During one such return, Preston stumbled through the door nearly frozen, having spent extra time securing a portion of fence that had collapsed under the weight of snow. Katherine helped him remove his ice-crusted coat, guiding him to sit before the fire. His hands were so cold they couldn't manage the buttons of his shirt. Without thinking, she began to unbutton it for him, only realizing the intimacy of the gesture when her fingers brushed against the skin of his chest. She started to pull away, but Preston caught her hand in his. "Katherine," he said, his voice rough with more than just cold. The moment stretched between them, filled with possibility. Then a log shifted in the fire, sending up a shower of sparks, breaking the spell. Katherine pulled her hand away gently, busying herself with fetching a blanket. "You need to warm up," she said practically, though her heart was racing. "I'll make some hot cider." In the kitchen, Katherine pressed her hands to her flushed cheeks. What was she doing? Preston was her employee, dependent on her for his livelihood. Any advances would be taking advantage of his situation, and yet the way he had looked at her. When she returned with the cider, Preston had composed himself, though his eyes followed her movements with undisguised interest. They spoke of neutral topics: the weather, the livestock, plans for spring planting, but beneath their words ran a current of awareness neither could fully ignore. Christmas approached, bringing with it memories that threatened Katherine's newfound contentment. Last Christmas had been her first without James, spent in numb grief. The prospect of another holiday, even with Preston's companionship, brought unexpected melancholy. Preston noticed her subdued mood and set about quietly bringing Christmas to the farm. Katherine woke one morning to find he'd cut a small pine tree and set it up in the corner of the sitting room. He'd fashioned simple decorations from pine cones, dried berries, and strips of colored cloth. "I know it's not much," he said, when she stood speechless in the doorway. "But no home should be without a Christmas tree." Katherine felt tears well in her eyes. "It's perfect," she managed. "Thank you." On Christmas Eve, they shared a special supper of roast chicken, potatoes, and apple pie. Preston had even managed to procure a small bottle of wine from a traveling peddler who'd passed through earlier in the month. As they sat by the fire afterward, Preston suddenly looked nervous. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his pocket. "It's not much, but—" He handed her a small cloth-wrapped package. Katherine opened it to find a delicately carved wooden pendant on a leather cord. The pendant was in the shape of a wildflower, its petals and leaves intricately detailed. "You made this?" she asked, running her finger over the smooth wood. Preston nodded. "Been working on it at night. It's meant to be a prairie rose. You mentioned once they were your favorite." Katherine was touched that he'd remembered such a small detail from one of their conversations. "It's beautiful. I'll treasure it." She slipped the cord over her head, the pendant resting just above her heart. "I have something for you too." She retrieved a package from behind a cushion and handed it to him. Inside was a fine leather-bound journal and a pen set. "You mentioned wanting to keep better records for the farm," she explained. But also, I thought you might want to write down some of those stories you tell so well, maybe even that book you talked about someday writing. Preston's expression of surprise and gratitude made her heart swell. This is the nicest gift I've received in years, he said softly. Thank you, Katherine. The fire crackled in the comfortable silence that followed. Outside, snow began to fall again, large flakes visible through the window, illuminated by the moonlight. Would you play something? Preston asked, nodding toward the small piano in the corner that had stood silent since James's death. Katherine hesitated. Music had been a joy she'd shared with her husband, one she'd abandoned in her grief. But tonight, with the Christmas tree glowing in the corner and Preston's gift against her skin, she found herself moving to the piano bench. Her fingers were stiff at first, but muscle memory soon took over as she played Silent Night. Preston watched her, his expression soft in the firelight. When she finished, he was beside her on the bench, their shoulders touching. That was lovely, he said. Katherine started another carol, and to her surprise, Preston began to sing in a rich baritone. She joined in, their voices blending in the warm room as snow continued to fall outside. When the song ended, they remained close, neither moving away. Katherine, Preston said her name like a prayer. I need to say something. She turned to face him fully, her hands still resting on the piano keys. Yes, I came here hungry and homeless, grateful for any work, but what I found. He paused, searching for words. What I found was so much more. You've given me not just food and shelter, but purpose. A place to belong, Katherine's heart pounded. You've given me just as much, hope, companionship. I'd forgotten what it was like not to be alone. Preston reached up slowly, as if giving her time to pull away, and touched her cheek. I never expected to feel this way again, or maybe I never felt this way before at all. Preston, Katherine whispered, leaning slightly into his touch, we should be careful, you work for me. I wouldn't want you to think I don't work for you, he interrupted gently. Not anymore. We're partners now, remember, and what I feel has nothing to do with gratitude. He leaned forward, hesitating just before his lips met hers, giving her a final chance to turn away. Instead, Katherine closed the distance between them, her lips meeting his in a kiss that started soft and tentative but quickly deepened with months of unspoken longing. When they finally broke apart, Katherine rested her forehead against his. I wasn't looking for this, she admitted. When you rode up that day, all I wanted was help with the farm. Preston smiled, running his thumb along her lower lip. And all I wanted was bread. The winter passed in a blur of quiet joy and deepening connection. They maintained separate sleeping arrangements, both aware of propriety and the need to be certain of their feelings before taking such a significant step. But their days were filled with shared work, conversation, and increasingly affectionate touches. While their evenings often ended with lingering kisses by the fire, by February, the harshest part of winter had passed, and they began making plans for spring planting. Preston had ideas for expanding the vegetable garden and adding a few fruit trees, while Katherine wanted to increase their dairy herd. They discussed each decision together, building a shared vision for the farm's future, their future. One clear, cold evening, Preston suggested a walk despite the snow on the ground. He seemed unusually serious, almost nervous, as he helped Katherine into her coat. They walked arm in arm toward the big oak tree where James was buried. Katherine's step faltered. Preston. I thought we should talk to him, Preston said quietly, if that's all right. The thoughtfulness of the gesture brought tears to Katherine's eyes. She nodded, allowing him to lead her to the simple marker. They stood together in respectful silence for a moment. James, Preston began, his voice steady in the still winter air. I never had the chance to know you, but I know you must have been a good man to have won Katherine's heart. I want you to know I'll take care of her and this land you both loved so much. I'll honor what you built here. Katherine squeezed his arm, too moved to speak. I came here planning to move on come spring, Preston continued, turning to face her. I've spent my whole adult life moving on, but now I can't imagine being anywhere but here with you. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple gold band. I've been saving this, bought it in town last month when I went for supplies. Katherine Vance, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife, partner in all things, not just this farm? Katherine looked from the ring to Preston's hopeful face, then to James's grave and back again. The guilt she had expected to feel didn't come. Instead, there was a sense of rightness, of life continuing as it should. "Yes," she said, her voice clear in the winter stillness. "Yes, Preston Norwood, I will marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger, then pulled her into a kiss that warmed them both despite the cold. They were married in April, as the first wildflowers began to bloom across the Colorado countryside. The ceremony was small, held in the town church with only a few neighbors and acquaintances in attendance. Katherine wore a new blue dress with Preston's wooden pendant around her neck, while he wore the shirt she had bought him in town all those months ago, freshly pressed for the occasion. That evening, they returned to their farm, truly theirs now as husband and wife. Preston carried Katherine across the threshold, both of them laughing at the old tradition. The house felt different somehow, filled with new possibilities while still honoring the past. Later, as they lay together in what was now their shared bedroom, Preston traced lazy patterns on Katherine's bare shoulder. "Do you remember what you said to me that first day?" he asked. Katherine smiled against his chest. "That I couldn't offer much pay. You said you needed to get the north field plowed, repair the barn roof, and bring in firewood if this place was going to survive another year." He kissed her forehead. "I think we did a bit better than just surviving." "We did," Katherine agreed, looking up at him in the moonlight streaming through the window. "And next winter I won't fear the cold at all." 5 years later, the Norwood farm had prospered beyond either of their expectations. Their dairy operation had expanded to 15 cows. They grew enough crops to sell the surplus in town. And their orchard of young apple trees promised a bountiful harvest in coming years. More precious than these material successes was their family. 3-year-old James Preston Norwood toddled after his father in the fields, wearing tiny overalls and a wide-brimmed hat that continually fell over his eyes. And in the farmhouse, Katherine rocked their 6-month-old daughter, Emma Rose, while preparing dinner. As the autumn wind once again rustled through the trees surrounding their property, Katherine watched from the window as Preston hoisted little James onto his shoulders, pointing out something in the distance. The scene was so different from that lonely day when she had stood in this same spot, desperate for help before winter. Preston had arrived hungry, willing to work for bread. She had needed a farmhand. What they'd found instead was a love that had transformed them both, turning a struggling homestead into a thriving farm and 2 solitary souls into a family. When Preston came in for supper, setting James down to run to his mother, he crossed to Katherine and kissed her tenderly, their daughter cradled between them. "Happy?" he asked, the question a ritual between them now. Katherine looked at her husband, at their son pulling impatiently at Preston's pant leg, at the healthy baby in her arms, and at the prosperous farm visible through the window. The north field was plowed, the barn roof was solid, and cords of firewood were neatly stacked by the house. Winter could come, they were ready for whatever seasons might bring. "Completely," she answered, rising on tiptoe to kiss him again. "Completely happy."